Aaron, look, you've said this, I don't know how many times to me in the last 105 days, that there are various parties who will not be party to a deal that results in the establishment of a Palestinian state. And Benjamin Netanyahu is one of them. With him at the table, it's not going to happen. So probably none of this is a surprise to you.
No, and thanks for having me, Ali. And you know that Tip O'Neill said that all politics is local, and clearly Mr. Netanyahu ideologically is opposed to a Palestinian state, but he also knows that several members of his government, should he agree to one right now, would probably jump ship. And that's going to mean, as you pointed out, he's on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in the Jerusalem District Court, now 3 years in running. Unless Mr. Netanyahu stays Prime Minister of Israel, it's less the war, Ali, it's the determination to hang on to power, because it's only through hanging on to power that he can seek to dilute or somehow end run that indictment. And I think that's the key here.
Let's talk about what this means. Some people are shocked at what Netanyahu has said, but a close study of Netanyahu since he first came to office will tell you that he's actually been relatively consistent on not being a champion for a two-state solution, or, in the case of the Palestinian Authority, actively undermining their ability to be a representative of the Palestinian people. He's succeeded. He's weakened the Palestinian Authority. He did empower Hamas, and they are empowered and now stronger than they were probably on October 6th. What can happen? We've heard this week that Americans are talking to other Israelis about what happens after Benjamin Netanyahu. But what can happen?
Well, there's the day after Gaza and there's the day after Netanyahu. The problem is that there's no mechanism right now to remove it. He has a majority of 64, and with Benny Gantz adding 12, Jews joined the war cabinet, that gives him a comfortable majority. So right now, literally, there's no way to end his prime ministry. It may well be, and I do not believe, Ali, that the most intense kinetic phase of this war is going to continue for several more months. The war is going to wind down. And at that point, the reservists are going to return home, many of whom are extremely critical of Netanyahu for his efforts to rearrange the political furniture in Israel and undermine the independence of the Supreme Court, of the judiciary. There may be increasing protests. At that point, Benny Gantz may decide to leave the government and to tell the people of Israel why he's leaving. So Netanyahu is not a sole unitary actor here. He's going to be under increasing pressure. There's also going to be a state commission of inquiry, which is going to address the issue of the massive intelligence and operational failure. So I'm afraid, and he's the worst of all possible combinations, because he's conflated his own legal and political travails with what he believes are the best interests of his country. He's the wrong leader to steer Israel through a critically important period. Problem is, as we approach presidential elections, he is banking on a Trump victory. There's no question about it. It will relieve some of the pressure, and Trump will create a sugar high for Israel. There's no doubt about that. But again, I'm not taking bets on this one. I think there's a reasonable chance that by the end of 2024, Benjamin Netanyahu may not be the prime minister of Israel. Let's hope. And again, having worked for Republicans and Democrats and voted for Republicans and Democrats, that Joe Biden is around to deal with the next Israeli government.
Aaron, typically Antony Blinken or people, American officials who have visited Israel since October 7th have gone to Israel, and then they've gone to other places, Qatar or Saudi Arabia. In this case, Blinken went to a number of Arab states first to try and coalesce around some kind of an agreement about what can happen to Gaza. And it was shot down the second he got to Israel. Netanyahu said, no deal. Blinken goes back empty-handed. That said, we've discussed the fact that Netanyahu is not looking for that sort of a situation. Is there anything about the discussions that Blinken had with Arab leaders that suggest a potential plan for Gaza in the post-war days?
I don't see one, frankly. I know it's sobering, annoyingly negative analysis, but I don't see one. An international force with the UN or outside one is not imaginable, frankly. The Arabs are not going to do the Israeli bidding, certainly while Israel remains militarily involved in Gaza, by sending their own forces. And the notion of bringing back the Palestinian Authority, training Palestinian security forces, even if you could work out the politics, is at least 8, 10, 12 months away. So nobody has an answer, frankly, to the day after, or even the day after the day after. And that's going to be a serious problem as we move to 2024. One last point. I do believe, though, that Joe Biden's demeanor, his emotional commitment to Israel, not to Netanyahu, means that he tends to want to accommodate, understand, and work with Netanyahu rather than confront him. The president has options. He could withhold or slow off military assistance. He actually seemed to rule that out tonight in his post phone call with Netanyahu's comments. He could change voting patterns in New York and abstain or vote for UN Security Council resolution. And in the nuclear option, should he choose, he could endorse a cessation of hostilities, which would put him fundamentally at odds with Benjamin Netanyahu's government. I just don't see, frankly, Ali, whether we're looking at a major breach between Israel and the United States anytime soon.